For those who are not familiar with the text that we are reading, this text was originally written by Sri Aurobindo in Sanskrit in an Upanishadic revelatory form, and it was part of his collection of writings which was discovered only very late and does not belong to the earlier collected works which were published during his centenary. They were first published in 1978 as a Sanskrit text as well as with an English translation by Jagannath Vedalankar. Sri Aurobindo had not given a title to this text, but the publisher and the translator gave it the title of Sri Aurobindo Upanishad. In a way, it is an apt title because it is written in an Upanishadic style, but it expresses Sri Aurobindo's world vision, his experience of reality. Every Upanishad, as we have learnt from him, is a book of knowledge in the profound sense of the word jnana, not an intelligence, not a thinking knowledge, creating a mental form of idea, but a deeper seeing of it with the soul. This is how Sri Aurobindo describes jnana. A seeing of it with the soul and a total living in it with the power of the inner being. A spiritual seizing by a kind of identification with the object of knowledge is jnana. So in the style of the Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo also communicates an experience. And as he advises us in our study of Upanishads, we are meant to pursue by a kind of an intuitive perception and allow the power of the revelatory word to lead us to deeper insight. So it is in this spirit that we have been studying this text also, as we studied the Isha Upanishad earlier, and we saw strong parallels between the Isha Upanishad and this text, not only in the vocabulary, not only in many key ideas, but also in the structure of the formulation. And I pointed out that the Isha Upanishad has 18 verses, and this Sri Aurobindo Upanishad has 19 verses, with one verse in the center, in the middle, with 9 before, 9 after, but this one in the center is like a fulcrum which simply states, whatever thus manifests is the world bliss only. And it is this which becomes like a turning point, while the first 9 verses lead us into a grand perspective of the cosmos, where all is included, nothing left out. From this fulcrum of transition, the second set of 9 verses then dwell on the bliss of manifestation, or manifestation as a movement of bliss of the Lord. So we are still in the first half, and we were reading last the verse 8. And to briefly recapitulate, in the first few verses, Sri Aurobindo grasps the totality of the cosmos. Om, there is Brahman alone, the one without a second, he begins. And then he discusses being and non-being, the past, present, future, the 4 degrees of Brahman's self-expression, but always with the insistence that the world is also Brahman, it is true, not false. There is the play and exploration of the transcendence of Brahman. Although he is above, yet he penetrates all the worlds. And although he is beyond being and non-being, he is at the same time all being, all consciousness, all bliss, the eternal divine. There is the exploration of this movement of manifestation as infinite quality, manifesting unendingly infinite possibilities. And yet he remains always beyond, transcending. Yet it is he who pours himself into this becoming of infinite qualities. He transcends the worlds, and yet he becomes the worlds and he enters into them. And the same with time. Although he is timeless, he becomes time and enters into time. Although he is infinite, he becomes the finite and enters into it. And so he is from the one, he becomes many. From the formless, he assumes forms. And all this, Sri Aurobindo says, he achieves by his Chit Shakti, consciousness force, which consists of the double movement of consciousness dwelling on its own multiplicity and drawing back into its own oneness, Vidya and Avidya. Throughout he remains alone, the single, the one. And so all these which are manifested, he says, are but names. What you call oneness, multiplicity, infinite, finite, all of these are names. Nama, we saw, has a very special sense in the yogic term. It is the way the divine sees himself, and the qualities that he sees in himself are the very name, the very form of his experience of himself, and therefore of his manifestation. So all these names shine out indeed in the world. And how do they shine out? How do they glow out? He says, the very self of the world is pure consciousness. And the world itself is pure consciousness shining out as so many names. And this, we saw how deep this description is. When we look at the world around us, everything we see, everything we experience, object, force, event, circumstances, mingling of all these, each of these is a unique experience of the self, of Brahman, dwelling on himself and drawing out that possibility. So this movement of drawing out, spreading out, sending out is like a radiation of his own light. But light, because it is radiation of his own awareness, he looks at himself and sees himself in infinite ways, and everything that he sees himself to be pours out, radiates, becomes form of experience. In a sense, when we look at the whole world around us, if we can dwell on the sense of the underlying presence of Brahman, we see that everything that exists is nothing but the unfolding, radiating out of his own consciousness. Our experience of form and separateness of form is only the way our mind interprets it. If you simply remove the mind from the picture, you cannot distinguish one thing from another. You see only an underlying unity. In fact, this is the practical problem of machines when they look at the world through a TV camera, through a webcam, a computer, a photo camera, sees the whole thing as one continuity of patterns of colors. It does not distinguish, this is bird, this is flower. It does not see separateness. It sees only continuity of variations of colors. And this is the problem we have. How do you get the machine to recognize this is a human being and that is not a human being? How do you teach the machine to separate and differentiate a function which is so natural to our mind? In fact, we realize to see an underlying continuity of reality is far easier if we simply stop the mind. Do not let it interfere. But we have mind and we have this differentiating power of mind with which we see world as pieces. And it is an important experience. But the reality behind, and we can remind ourselves or even teach ourselves to see it, is only this radiation of the light of Brahman, of his consciousness, from the self of consciousness to form of consciousness, which is the world. And in the verse 7, which we read last time, he links all of these things from verse 1 to 6, all of these in one single description, all comprehensive, everything held in a single vision. And the Sanskrit text goes simply like this, very brief. Om Tat Sat Yatcha Satchideva Tat Chinmayam Jagad Bhasate Chidatmani Satya Prakasha Satyasya Bhagavatah. And everything is linked from the highest to the most material in a single movement of vision. So starting with Om. Om, as we have seen, is the totality of Brahman. U, Ma, and the transcendence. He is Brahman revealed as the waking objective reality, is the U is the inner dream experience, the inner worlds, the subtle domains. The Ma is the sleep state, as it is called, but it is the state of deep concentration where all potential is held without differentiation. And then the silence that follows is the transcendence. So Om is the very first, from which Tat Sat, that truth, the absolute truth and the highest, which we cannot conceive, it is beyond mind. So Om, all comprehensive, that truth. Yatcha Satchideva, which is Sat and Chit alone, the sheer existence and the sheer consciousness alone. And already it has moved from that transcendence, Tat Sat, to the form of consciousness when he knows himself to be sheer existence consciousness. And then Tat Chinmayam Jagat Bhasate Chidatmani, that glows out of consciousness, glows out as consciousness from the heart of consciousness. So it is Sat, Chit, but as Chit, sheer consciousness, it glows out in its consciousness from the heart of consciousness. Jagat Bhasate, Jagat is that which is born of movement, which sustains by movement, and that is Jagata, born of movement, Gati, the world in movement, in manifestation. So the whole consciousness becomes Jagat, this movement of manifestation, but how? Bhasate, radiance, illumination, light spreading out. Bha, the root sound, is this radiation of light, the glowing out of consciousness. Bhasate is in the movement of radiating consciousness. So, Tat Chinmayam Jagat Bhasate Chidatmani. Chid Atmani, from the Atman of consciousness, from the self of consciousness, it glows out this light of consciousness to become Jagat, the world manifested, which is itself of the nature of consciousness. All is consciousness, but consciousness is, in essence, glows out to consciousness of form. And then he says, Satya Prakasha, the light is truth, of truth and itself truth. Satyasya Bhagavatah, emerging from the divine which is himself truth. So this captures the whole movement from the highest to the most manifest form of the world in one single vision. And so this verse 7 gives you the most comprehensive experience, perception of the reality of the world, and throughout it is the real. Nothing is ever illusion or false deception or falsehood or a lie. The next verse, 8, which we read once last time and had a first glimpse of it, now takes up this one vision, but develops it or leads us to it through analogy of an imagery and affirms the reality of it all. So verse 8 takes the analogy of the sun. As the reflection of the sun is one in calm water, but multiple in restless water. Real is the sun, real the reflection, the real light of the real sun. It is not a dream, but the light of a reality. So this is the first image. And then there are two other images which follow. After these three images are given to us, which we will again dwell upon, the sentence continues, similarly here, the world Brahman is the true light of the divine, not a dream, not illusory, nor a false shining. It is the real light of the reality. Not the divine in himself, but still he himself only. So it starts with as the reflection of the sun, so the world Brahman is the true light of the divine. So this is the full idea that the verse expresses. There is more to it, but this is the idea behind it. He is now using this analogy of the sun to show us the relationship of this manifest world with the source of that reality, that sheer absolute. That is in the symbol related to the sun. And then there is something which radiates, which is not sun, and yet it is only sun. There is nothing else. But it is not the totality of the sun. It is a power or light or illumination, something emerging from the sun. But that undergoes a shift, a transition into form. There is a reflection. And in the reflection, you do not see the form as it is in its origin, but a shift, a change in the form. The analogy here is the water. When it is still, you see the sphere of the sun, the circle, the disk of the sun reflected perfectly. But when the water is restless, then it is fragmented and you see so many flashing reflections of light. So in the first image that is used, there is a profound truth that is also revealed. These are not merely analogies, as we said last time. They are also realities, deep symbolic truths. And the Vedic rishis used these images because they captured through material sense a deeper spiritual reality. So in the three images he uses, the second image goes like this. Or as the light of the sun shines, filling the solar world with its force, as if running. Real is that light, the real luster of the real sun, that is not false shining, but a real luster of a reality. And in the third image, or as the flaming disk of the sun is not the sun itself, but this material form only manifests the sunness of the sun to our knowledge, which is dependent on the material being. The sun is beyond that form. Real is the sun, real the form in the shape of the disk. It is the real light of the real sun, not illusory, but the real light of a reality. Now, in these 3 steps, we looked at it briefly last time, but now we will elaborate. In these 3 steps, he leads us from the most material sensory experience of the truth behind the sun to the deepest perception of that reality. The first one looks at the experience purely through the senses. The second looks at the reality through the mental consciousness. And the third transcends the mind and sees a greater truth beyond. Now, in so doing, through these 3 steps, he is also capturing the 3 degrees of Brahman's manifestation. Remember, which we mentioned earlier, U and Ma. The Brahman in the waking state, the objective world which we see through the senses. Brahman in the dream state which we see in the inner worlds and with the mind's eye in the dream state. Brahman in his trance state, sleep state, where all potential is held. And these are the 3 degrees of Brahman's manifestation. There is, of course, himself as transcendent. And you notice these 3 images, these 3 symbols actually represent these 3 gradations of Brahman. So when immediately after, Sri Aurobindo says, similarly here the world Brahman is the true light of the divine, and he uses this phrase, world Brahman. In Sanskrit, Tathaiva Jagat Brahman. In the same way, the world Brahman is, and the text goes on. When he speaks of world Brahman, he is reminding us that Brahman is not just this world which we see with our senses, but all of those, the subtle worlds and the causal world, which we do not see. But the reality is common and continuous across all of them. And so, in describing this analogy through the symbol of the sun, he's actually leading us through these 3 steps and reminding us of the 3 gradations of reality, which are all part of one continuity. So now with that we explore this a little more. We will repeat some of the things we discussed last time, but go deeper. So in the first image, which is through our physical senses, and it is something worth meditating upon, we have that opportunity here if we see the sunrise on the ocean, to meditate on this idea as we gaze at the sun. As the reflection of the sun is one in calm water, but multiple in restless water, we see here 2 levels of reality. One is the sun and as a reflection, and the second is in our seeing the breakup of the reflection. There are 2 levels of translation. In the same way, that absolute truth, Tat Sat, first knows itself as Sat Chit Ananda. And in a way, that is a shift, a transition from a pure truth to form of truth. And then the Satchidananda reflects itself into the Manas, Prana and Annam, triple lower world. And then we in that, in an individualized consciousness, see it fragmented into individual pieces. So actually there are 3 levels. The first is the transition from that which is indescribable, unknowable, into Satchidananda. And that is what comes in the third image, where there is the sunness which becomes the disk of the sun. So there's a first translation there. A second translation which is from sun to its reflection. And we see Satchidananda reflected into the lower triple world. The power by which that reflection takes place is the supermind in between, the Vijnanam. the link point. And it is there that we see the radiance, the moving from the oneness to the many, as light of sun also. But it is sun also emanating as light of sun. And then, although we have this world of mind, life and body, we ourselves in that world as individuals are in a consciousness that is fragmented and cut off, and so our entire perception is fragmented and cut off. And so we see separateness where there is only continuity. Observe the tree. When you say this is flower, that is tree, that is fruit, that is bird, can you really differentiate? If you go deep into it, you will see continuity of form. You will say, oh, the molecules of the flower are different from the molecules of the stem. Yes, but are they really so different? Go a little deeper. And you see the molecules are made of the same atoms, differently arranged. And the atoms are made of the same subatomic particles in different continuity of arrangements. Can you really make a difference? You cannot. If you go still deeper, you see only the same one underlying energy flowing in different rhythms. And it is the reality for the whole world. You cannot separate any one thing from another. And yet to our sight, we see only this separateness. It's interesting that even in our own individualized mind, the separation has to be created in a special effort. My favorite example of this is what happens when people have gone through a special kind of surgery of the brain where the left and right brains are separated. And we find, interestingly, that the right half of the brain connects to the left half of the brain connects to the right eye. There's a cross connection, but the functions of the two halves are so different. The right half, which Aurobindo calls the right hand powers of knowledge, which in the terms of this, in the terminology of the Upanishad is Vidya. And the left half of the brain is the servant of knowledge, Aurobindo says, which in the terminology of Upanishad is the Avidya. One concentrating on the oneness, the other concentrating on the distinctions. So in modern psychological phrasing, they will say the right brain focuses on the underlying qualities, values, feeling, experience, whereas the left half of the brain focuses on numbers, distinctions, grammar, structure, difference, and so on. So when this link between the two, the Vidya, Avidya powers of knowledge, of consciousness, are separated and each attached to a separate eye, we have some remarkable experiences. And when such a person is shown a beautiful scene as a picture, and he is asked to see it with his right eye, that means the left brain, the Avidya power, and with the left eye covered, with his right eye, left brain, he sees the picture, he says, he's asked, what do you see? Well, I see the sun, I see water, I see tree, I see bird, and he describes all the pieces. And he's asked, what do you feel? He says, I don't know. The same person now is asked to see with his left eye. Now, the right brain, the Vidya power, the consciousness of unity underlying. He looks at the picture and he says, oh, it's so beautiful. But what are you seeing? He says, I don't know. He cannot distinguish between the different pieces, the parts of that beautiful scene. And this is in the normal functioning of our brain, where the power of consciousness is organized in this double status of Vidya and Avidya. So if you think about it, this experience of differentiation, of separation, is a very superficial experience taking place in the left half of the brain's organization as a secondary power subservient to the right half, which is the greater power, which sees the underlying oneness. And the second functioning of the secondary power of the left brain has actually to make a special effort to make those distinctions. So in this last step, where the reflection of the sun, which would have been nice, neat, one circle, is broken up into this shaking fragmentation, that is happening at a very superficial level in our sense mind. And even there, by a special power of consciousness focused on making distinctions. If that power was not focused on it, it would not happen. That is the power of avidya. But it happens also because that power focusing on distinctions is in agitation and activity of making distinctions. The moment that agitation, the disturbance of restlessness of the water is quieted, automatically that power stills, and the experience behind of the first power of vidya and its organization in the right brain, that is active, that reveals itself, and you see the underlying oneness. So this image which is described here is a very profound image. It captures such deep truths, and yet it is expressed in a way that even a child will understand. And what do we say to the child? Your mind is like the restless waters. When the sun of truth, the true knowledge above, reflects in your mind, its restlessness breaks up the truth, and you see so many different fragments. And your mind is attracted to the different pieces, the flashes of light, and the moment it turns to the flash, it captures and it loses what it captures. The flash is gone. Try to observe the sun's reflection in the shaking waters. You see a flash, your attention turns to it, the flash is gone. Another flash attracts your attention, and your mind keeps jumping across flashes, wandering restlessly, never catching what it is seeking. And your mind, agitated, restless, is like this. And therefore, the first principle of yoga, to find oneness, to find union with the source, the truth, the divine, the reality, the first principle to find it is still your mind, quiet your consciousness. Chitta, vritti, nirodha, the tendency of agitation in the mind, in your consciousness, must be stilled. Then automatically, effortlessly, the underlying reality shines out, because it was always there. It was covered by this agitation. We may use the analogy also of a flag, a picture on a piece of cloth, and the cloth is shaking in the wind. You can't see the picture, you can't make out, because it's moving continuously. It is only when you can still the wind, still the cloth, that you're able to see the picture. But the picture never moved, isn't it? There's a beautiful story from the Buddhist tradition. There's a longer part to the story. There was a great master who initiated his disciple and declared him the next in his lineage, but because his other disciples were against him, he was driven out from the monastery and so on. So now he lived in a hiding his identity. One day he is walking around, and he finds two monks arguing. So this is now the secret master, the next master in the lineage, but he is secret, no one knows who he is. He's listening to this argument. The first monk says, and they are looking at the flag that is shaking in the wind. The first monk says that the flag is shaking. The second monk says, no, it is the wind that is shaking. If you think about it, it's a very interesting experience. You watch the flag shaking and you think first, that's the first perception of your senses, the flag is moving. But if you go slightly behind, it is not the flag which is moving, it is the wind which is moving. And the flag is carried by the wind, it is not moving. And then this secret master comes and says, "You are both wrong. Neither the wind moves nor the flag. It is your mind that moves." And this is the deeper reality behind. And if somehow you could quiet your mind, still it, you would see flag, you would see wind without movement. It doesn't mean the movement is gone, you'll still see movement, but you'll see the underlying reality, which is they always are what they are. There is no real movement. Movement is an appearance created by the movement of your own mind. And so the fact that he says it, the head of that monastery says, this is a special man. He is not an ordinary man. So he goes after him, finds him out, and eventually he takes his rightful place in the monastery and so on. But this depth of perception, it is your mind that moves. It is this which is being taught in a different way, in such a simple image, when we tell the child that it is your mind's agitation which fragments your perception of reality. The reality is still one. The reflection of the sun is still one. It is the agitation of restlessness of the receiving waters, your mind, which breaks it up. It's a very simple symbol. And yet you can see how profound it is, how many layers are behind it. And the biggest truth behind is, even what our mind receives is a reflection. Even when the mind is still and sees the whole, what you're seeing is a reflection, not the thing in itself. And you must go a step further beyond that to know the sun, of which your mind can only receive the reflection. As long as you live in mind, you cannot know the sun for what it is. And therefore, in the integral yoga, there is the ascent from the mind to higher gradations of mind to the sun itself, which is the supramental sun. But, as the third image will teach us, the flaming disk of the sun is not the sun itself. It is the material form of the sunness which is behind, which is essentially formless. And so we must go one more degree in complete identification with that which is sunness of sun. And then from there you know truly the reality of the world as it is. But for the moment we look at this first step. As the reflection of the sun is one in calm water, but multiple in restless water, real is the sun, real the reflection, the real light of the real sun. It is not a dream, but the light of a reality. So here the emphasis is on the fact of the continuity of reality. We say the sun is real. The reflection is not unreal, it is also real because it is an expression of the sun's light. And the light of the sun is also real. Just because it emerges from the sun and moves out beyond the sun does not mean it ceases to be real. It is reality of the sun radiating out as form of light. And that light then enters the restless waters or the still and calm waters, reflects from there. Just because it has reflected does not make it unreal. It is still the same real light of the real sun which reaches you as a real reflection. We can even say your perception of it may be unreal. But Sri Aurobindo goes a step further later on and says, even that is not strictly speaking unreal, because your perception also is a real perception of the fragmented light. He says later on at the end of this, in the next verse 9, he says, all this is phenomenally true but false in reality. That is, in your appearance it appears false. This is for the satisfaction of the mind, we say this. For the comprehensive knowledge, that is the all knowledge, the true knowledge of Brahman in its totality. For the comprehensive knowledge, it must be said that there is nothing unreal in the real Brahman. All this is taking place ultimately in Brahman as himself. And there is nothing unreal in it. And we would put it in this way: in the experience of your seeing of the fragmented light, even the fragmented reflection is not unreal because it is being seen by the Brahman within you. And what he sees is real because he is real. So, real is the sun, real the reflection, the real light of the real sun. But it is not a dream, but the light of a reality. Mother similarly deals with this question of unreality of the world, particularly in the modern circumstance of the strong power that the current Vedantic teaching has, which even declares the world as an illusion. Not the original Vedantic tradition, which did not declare it illusion, but the post-Shankara tradition, which declares the world illusion. Mother said, it's not wrong to say that. Mother says it is not wrong to say that, but the correct formulation would be, our perception, what we see, is illusory. But the world is not an illusion. We are seeing the world in an appearance and not its reality. But the world is real. And we can correct for our seeing. And that's really the whole journey of awakening. But from an ultimate perspective, even that is Brahman seeing, and therefore it is Brahman choosing to see the world in a certain way. So there is nothing which is unreal. So this is the first image analogy that is used. Now the next one takes the same picture, goes a little deeper. Beyond the senses to the domain of the mind's perception, the inner worlds of Brahman. Or as the light of the sun shines, filling the solar world with its force, as if running. Real is that light, the real luster of the real sun. This is not false shining, but a real luster of a reality. Now this picture is a little different. We are not seeing with our senses anymore. But the emphasis now is on the relationship between the sun and the light. In the first analogy, the sun was there, the light was there, and the reflection was there. And now we have dropped the reflection. That's not so important. It is the light which we are looking at. And the sun and the light are different, and yet they are the same. What is their relationship? So here he describes, as the light of the sun shines, filling the solar world with its force, as if running. So there is the sun which does not run. It does not move. There is its light, which is sun, but somehow which emerges from the sun and is running, as if running away. And it is moving. It is not still. If you try to capture light, to stop it, it ceases to exist. Recently, barely 2 weeks ago, you would have seen perhaps a prominent news item which said, light stopped for up to 1 minute. Look it up. It's an interesting scientific experiment. And the scientists are thrilled. They say, we were able to stop a ray of light, lock it into a crystal for up to 1 minute, and then release it, and it came out again as light. And it was the same light. Great technological achievement. But if you observe carefully, read carefully, what happened was the light was absorbed by the crystal and then released again. But while it was in the crystal, so-called stopped light, it was not light. What was it? It was not light. It was just a bundle of energy which kept the memory or the pattern of the light, the information of the light. And when it was released, it became light again, revealing the same information. But while it was held inside, it was not light. You didn't see it as light. Light exists only in movement. It does not exist in stopping. You stop it, it ceases to be light. It's something else. Maybe it is particle. In quantum mechanics, they say a ray of radiation comes and is captured and becomes a particle. Or a particle throws out a photon and becomes now a ray of light. Is there a difference between the wave of light and the particle of light? They do not see a difference. We could even say when it is in movement, it is a ray of light as a wave. When it is stopped or captured, we see it as a particle. But now it is no more light, isn't it? A photon, by definition, even going to the material physics, by definition, a photon has no mass. And it has to move at that speed. You stop it, and it ceases to be a photon. So we are seeing two very different things. There is the sun, and somehow it shines out, and the light which radiates is as if running. But what is running? What is moving? And the wording is very interesting. Or as the light of the sun shines, filling the solar world with its force, as if running. Filling the world with its force. What is that light? It is force of the sun, power of the sun, filling his world, the solar world. It is his because it is made of his light filling it. There is nothing other than that. So we see two statuses. There is the sun, which is as if static, not moving, and then there is power or force of sun spreading, radiating, filling and forming his world. And you see the analogy straight away with the higher truths. There is the divine in himself, in his awareness, and there is power of awareness, Chit Shakti, by which he radiates out to become the world, also of consciousness, from self of consciousness radiating to world of consciousness, which we saw just in the earlier verse. It's the same idea, but now drawn into this analogy of the symbol of the sun. But consider, everywhere in what we call the solar system. Why do you call it solar system? Because it is dominated by the sun. Everything that happens is under the control and power of the sun. There is I forget the term exactly, just as the earth has an atmosphere, the sun has its own solar atmosphere, I forget the technical term, which extends all the way around the solar system, and there is a point where it ends. And then the proper space of the galactic space starts. What is very interesting today, and perhaps symbolic for Earth's evolution perhaps, is that two spacecrafts that were launched now more than 40 years ago, Pioneer 1 and Pioneer 2, have reached that edge of the solar system, where the radiation of the sun, the power and energy of the sun are as if ending, and there is a transition into the galactic space proper. And the transition is now being measured, and there are very interesting, fascinating descriptions we see. So far, as long as it was in the domain of the sun, there was as if a hold of the sun's magnetism and electric field, which was even and extending out from the sun. Now it is reaching a transitional period where there are rapid fluctuations, rapid changes, and then it will suddenly enter a different energy, a different field, a different magnetism, which belongs to the galactic center. And it's in that transition where there are fluctuations. If you've ever seen two rivers meeting, you see the smooth waters, and at the point where they touch, there are these continuous agitations and ripples until they merge completely. But the point of contact is this agitation. What we see here in this description is the solar world is defined by the sun's light, the sun's radiance, the sun's power and force. And the force is not fixed, it is moving. You will remember in our study of Sri Aurobindo's Isha Upanishad in aphoristic form, where he restates the Isha in his own aphorisms, he discussed how all this world is movement of Kali, force. But where it is moving, we call it force. Where the movement repeats itself in a rhythm, we call it form. What's the difference between force and form? When force enters a repetitive movement, you call it form. You look at the atom, the whirling electrons around the core, because they are repeating, we say, oh, this is a fixed atom, it's an object, it's a form. But if you release the form, what do you see? Everything is moving inside. It is pure force in movement. Something of this idea you'll find in this. There is the sun shining, filling the solar world with its force as if running. There is movement, power of manifestation emerging out of consciousness. Consciousness turning into power of consciousness expressed as force. So in this analogy now, we are seeing a deeper truth, a deeper perception of the symbol, but it exists not in our senses because you do not see the light moving in space. You see the light only when it hits something and reflects from something. If you look at empty space, you see it as dark because the light is not reflecting against anything. You put an object there, it reflects the light, you say, now I see there is an object because of the light. But the light in itself we do not see. But in our mind's eye, when we close the physical eyes, in our mind's eye we see all the rays of the sun radiating everywhere in all directions. With the full intensity of what? The sun itself. What is the light made of? Substance of sun, power of sun, energy of sun in movement. You could even say, what is sun? It is light of sun bound, not radiating out in movement, but bound into form. And you don't see anymore a difference. It is sun bound in form, sun in movement of light, of radiation. So in this image now we see, as the light of the sun shines, filling the solar world with its force, as if running. But the suggestion, why does he say as if running? Because actually it is not running. It also is. The light of the sun radiating also is, but to our perception it is as if running. And again the emphasis on the reality, the real luster of the real sun, that is not false shining, but a real luster of a reality. And we must complete this sentence, so it is that the world Brahman is the true light of the divine. Now we come back to the original picture. He is teaching us about the relationship of the world with the divine now seen as the sun, and the world as the radiance of his light. But what is the world made of? It is made of his light. There is nothing other. It is his force, it is his power of consciousness which makes the world and which forms everything in the world and allows us to see in the world. The illumination of that light, our seeing, is his consciousness revealing itself to what? To our consciousness, which is what? His consciousness. So when you see the boat on the ocean and the sunlight reflecting from it reveals the boat, who sees the boat? I. Who am I? The same sunlight which formed all that has formed me, and in me reveals the boat. On my retina, on the reflection in my retina, in my brain, in my mind, which is a reflection of his light also. So ultimately, Sri Aurobindo says, all sense experience is contact of consciousness with consciousness. The whole world experience which we know through the senses is nothing but the divine consciousness in us meeting the divine consciousness in the other. And that is what creates, by its friction, the sense of sensation and the five senses. All five senses, all world experience is through five senses. is consciousness meeting consciousness, divine meeting divine. So, the world also is real because it is the divine radiating to become world of consciousness. And we move now to the third analogy, the third symbol, which goes one step deeper. It considers what is the sun. So far, the first one looked more at the reflection, the second looked more at the radiance. Now the third one looks at the sun itself. You're seeing a sun, the disk there. What is that? In reality, and this takes us to the third level of the manifestation of Brahman, the Brahman in trance, the sleep state as it is called. Or as the flaming disk of the sun is not the sun itself, but this material form only manifests the sunness of the sun to our knowledge, which is dependent on the material being. The sun is beyond that form. And we have to ask ourselves this question. When we have sent a spacecraft to measure the sun's size, we see all these great explosions and the electrical lightning on the sun's surface. Do we know what the sun truly is? What makes the sun give out so much energy? Where does that energy come from? And to this day, scientists don't know. We have a dozen theories. None of them are proved conclusively. They're all speculative. The reality is, somehow this sun pours out this immense energy and does not die out. Where does the energy come from? Sri Aurobindo uses this very suggestively when he says, describing the Divine Mother, he says in Savitri, the sun from which we kindle all our suns. Suggesting that the power of the sun, which is radiated out in form of energy, even material energy, and even spiritual energy, is all in its source that Chit Shakti that is she, the Divine Mother. The physical appearance of the sun is only the material concretization of this inexhaustible creative power of the divine. And you see, literally in our solar system, the sun fulfills that function. It creates everything that exists in the solar system. We are taught by physics that all the matter of the earth was created in the sun. Under intense heat and pressure, hydrogen atoms, the most simple form, electron, proton bound together, are squeezed together as in a pressure cooker, joined together to create all these elements. What is the sun doing truly? It is a creator. Creator of all matter, of all substance, and interestingly, of all energy in the solar system. Where does the earth get its energy? From the sun. Everything in the solar system exists by the sun and comes from the sun. There is no other. And look at what it's saying here. There is sunness which becomes sun and which radiates out to become world. Everything originates in that sunness. What is that sunness of which the physical sun that we see, the orb that we see, is a form? And here it is not stated. We simply say it is the divine himself. But the orb is only the form by which the sunness expresses itself in the material world. So, or as the flaming disk of the sun is not the sun itself, but this material form only manifests the sunness of the sun to our knowledge, which is dependent on the material being. The sun is beyond that form. So if you think of it this way, purely of the material processes of the sun, you will say, the creative power within the sun, by which all this is created, is the true sun. But it is pure power. Where is its form? It has no form. When it starts creating, its process of creation and creating this material and manifesting the material and throwing it out creates the appearance of this disk of the sun. that to our physical sight and to our material consciousness, which can only touch the material substance of sun, is the appearance of sun, because we live in material consciousness. If we rose above that into some deeper perception, we would see the physical form of the sun as only a side effect, a phenomenon, a container of the true sun, which is the power present within. And so we call it in the Indian tradition Surya Deva, the Lord of Sun. He is a divine being, a conscious being, a form of consciousness which we can relate to, we can invoke, we can receive from him the sunness, which is that creative power of knowledge and power to manifest, and so on. So there is this distinction made between sunness and the form of the sun. To our knowledge, which is dependent on the material being, we see this manifested form of the disk. But the sun is beyond that form. Real is the sun, real the form in the shape of the disk. It is the real light of the real sun, not illusory, but the real light of a reality. So straight away in these three analogies, we see the sunness, which is the reality, taking form of sun, which then pours itself out as radiance of light, which reflects, and in the reflection appears as fragmented. So it is similarly here, the world Brahman is the true light of the divine, not a dream, nor illusory, nor a false shining. It is the real light of the reality, not the divine in himself, but still he himself only. This is the supreme Maya. Maya is the creative power. We will discuss this more next Sunday. This is the supreme Maya. This is the greatness of the yoga, of the mysterious Lord of Yoga, Sri Krishna. So what is this greatness of yoga and the Lord of Yoga? It's all bound in the same image, which we will explore. This is his blissful Leela with his consciousness force, Chit Shakti. This is the inconceivable working of the Supreme. So this whole description we will take up in detail for next time. But for now, we just see the analogy and the symbols that Sri Aurobindo has used through these three steps, and how he leads us from a sense perception to a mental perception to something still deeper, which is almost intuitive and transcends mind. To show us the world is also Brahman and a true light of the real Brahman, and we must therefore accept the world as manifestation of Brahman. And later he will tell us, whatever thus manifests is the world bliss only. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.